In the bone-dry autumn of 1886, on the vast, windswept plains of Pembina County in the Dakota Territory, the settlers prepared for winter with a familiar, frantic energy. The air, already sharp with the promise of frost, carried the rhythmic ringing of axes and the groan of crosscut saws. Men hammered and caulked, sealing every visible crack in their log cabins with a mixture of mud and moss, a ritual as old as their settlement. They stockpiled wood in great, towering ricks that stood like monuments to their industry, each cord a bulwark against the coming cold. All but one of them. Axel Jorgensen, a quiet Finn who had homesteaded the quarter section bordering the frozen marsh, engaged in a ritual that baffled and amused his neighbors. While their cabins were single, formidable walls of thick, hand-hewn logs, Jorgensen was building his with two distinct, thinner walls, separated by a curious gap of nearly a foot. And while they gathered the most substantial fuel they could find, split oak and ash, Jorgensen spent his days hauling wagon loads of sawdust from the new lumber mill and collecting dried sphagnum moss from the marsh edge. He meticulously mixed this refuse, this waste, and packed it into the cavity between his two walls. His neighbors watched from a distance, leaning on their axe handles, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw a man building a fence around a house, a flimsy inner shell, and an equally flimsy outer one, and filling the space with what amounted to kindling. "It's a waste of good lumber," declared Elias Thorne, a man whose family had been on the frontier for 2 generations and who saw himself as the arbiter of practical sense. Building 2 walls to do the job of one and filling it with dust, the man's inviting fire into his home. The sentiment rippled through the small community. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. They called it the Finn's folly, a structure born of ignorance, a strange and unnatural design that defied the hard-won wisdom of the plains. They pointed to their own thick-walled cabins, their high-peaked roofs designed to shed snow, and their massive stone fireplaces, confident in the brute force of their methods. Theirs was a logic of mass and fire. More wood in the wall, more wood in the stove. It was simple. It was proven. Yet, just over a year later, the Great Blizzard of 1888, a storm that would be spoken of for a century as the schoolhouse blizzard, descended upon them with the speed and fury of a wolf pack. It was a maelstrom of ice and wind that shattered thermometers and turned the world into a featureless, roaring whiteness. Inside the stout log cabins of Elias Thorne and his neighbors, the stoves, burning with a desperate intensity, could not beat back the cold that bled through the solid wood. Drafts shrieked through the mud, chinking, and frost climbed the interior walls in crystalline ferns. But inside the Finn's folly, a single small fire in a modest iron stove kept the single room at a steady, comfortable temperature, the silence within broken only by the muffled howl of the storm outside. The foolishness, it turned out, was a fortress. The wastefulness was a wellspring of warmth. What did Axel Jorgensen understand about the subtle, invisible laws of heat and air that everyone else, in their reliance on brute force and tradition, had dismissed as foolish? What secret was held in that wall of sawdust and moss? A secret that turned the most terrifying blizzard of the century into little more than a distant rumor. The answer lay not in magic, but in a profound, practical understanding of physics, learned not in a university, but in the harsh classroom of a northern homeland and the quiet observation of the natural world. Axel Jorgensen had been born in the Kainuu region of Finland, a land of immense forests, sprawling lakes, and winters that were not merely seasons, but governing forces of life itself. There, survival was a science of nuance, not of overwhelming force. He grew up not in a log cabin of the American frontier style, with single, massive timbers, but in a home built with a different philosophy. His grandfather's house had walls of squared logs, yes, but they were carefully scribed and fitted with a layer of moss in every seam, creating a nearly airtight barrier. More importantly, he remembered the rehe, the combination threshing house and sauna, which was the heart of the farmstead. Its low ceilings and thick, smoke-blackened walls, often banked with earth, were designed not just to be strong, but to hold a breath of heat for days on end from a single firing. The old wisdom was not about generating more heat, but about losing less of it. When he immigrated to America, he first found work in the sprawling lumber camps of Michigan, and later at the massive ice harvesting operations on the Great Lakes. It was in the ice houses that a crucial piece of the puzzle fell into place. He saw how men built colossal wooden warehouses, some 10 stories high, to store the winter's harvest of ice through the blistering heat of summer. The secret was not refrigeration, but insulation. They constructed double walls, and the wide space between them was filled, from floor to ceiling, with sawdust. The same material the sawmills discarded as waste, the same material his neighbors now mocked him for collecting, was the very substance that kept thousands of tons of frozen water from melting under a July sun. He watched as men, sweating in the summer heat, would open a door into the ice house and be met with a gust of frigid air. The sawdust did not create cold, it simply trapped it, preventing the sun's warmth from penetrating the walls. It was a barrier. The final piece of his understanding came not from his homeland or his labor, but from a chance encounter during his first autumn in the Dakota Territory. While tracking a deer near the marsh, he came upon an elderly Anishinaabe man, wrapped in a bison hide, checking his muskrat traps. They shared a moment of quiet respect, and through a mix of gestures and broken English, Axel asked how he endured the winters with only a hide-covered lodge for shelter. The old man, whose name he never learned, smiled. He tapped his own chest, then held his hands apart, then tapped his bison robe. He showed Axel the robe's construction, the thick, tough leather on the outside, and the dense, woolly fur on the inside. The secret, he conveyed, was not the thickness of the hide, but the air trapped within the countless fibers of the fur. That trapped air, he explained, was a wall, a warm wall. The bison's life depended on it. His people's lives depended on understanding it. These 3 streams of knowledge, the Finnish tradition of thermal containment, the industrial application of sawdust insulation, and the indigenous wisdom of natural air gaps, converged in Axel's mind. He began to see the invisible enemy he was fighting. It was not the cold itself. The cold was merely an absence of heat. The true enemies were conduction, convection, and radiation, the 3 ways heat escaped. He understood, in a way his neighbors did not, that their thick log walls were actually highways for heat loss. A solid log, dense and filled with frozen moisture, was an excellent conductor. The heat from their stoves would literally flow through the wood to the colder outside air, a constant, silent drain on their fuel. He could almost visualize the warmth being wicked away, molecule by molecule. Then there was convection, the smallest crack or seam in their chinking, and there were always hundreds, created a current. The warm, lighter air inside the cabin would push its way out, while the dense, frigid outside air would be pulled in, creating insidious drafts that chilled the room and made the stove work harder, consuming more and more wood just to fight the incoming tide of cold. Their high vaulted ceilings, a point of pride for men like Elias Thorne, were a terrible liability. They created a huge, useless volume of air high above their heads, where all the precious heat would rise and collect, doing no one any good before it was ultimately lost through the roof. Axel's design was a systematic attack on all three forms of heat transfer. The double wall was the foundation of his strategy. The wide 12-inch gap he created was not just a space, it was a weapon. By filling this gap with a loose, low-density mixture of sawdust and dried moss, he was creating millions upon millions of tiny air pockets. This was the principle of the bison fir, magnified. Air itself is a poor conductor of heat, but only if it cannot move. The sawdust and moss mixture effectively stopped the air from moving within the wall cavity, preventing the formation of convective loops where warm air would rise on the inner side and cold air would sink on the outer side, transferring heat across the gap. He had created a massive 12-inch barrier of what he called dead air. The heat from his stove would have to fight its way through the inner wall, then through this vast, stagnant sea of insulated air, and finally through the outer wall. It was a journey most of the heat would never complete. Conduction was defeated. The careful construction of his walls, with overlapping boards and tar paper linings, made them virtually airtight, eliminating the drafts that plagued his neighbors. Convection was defeated. Finally, by keeping his ceilings low, just 6.5 feet from the floor, he kept the warm air where it belonged, down in the living space. This reduced the overall volume of the cabin that needed to be heated and minimized the surface area through which heat could be lost. He was building a small, tight, insulated box, a thermal fortress. His neighbors, with their grand, drafty halls, were trying to heat the entire Dakota territory. He was simply trying to stay warm. The construction began in the late summer of 1886. It was a slow, solitary process, and every stage of it drew quiet scorn. He began not with massive foundation stones, but with a raised wooden foundation on cedar posts, lifting the floor off the frozen ground to create yet another dead airspace beneath the cabin. "Building it on stilts," Elias Thorne remarked to his friends. "First good wind will take it." Axel laid 2 parallel sill plates, the framework for his inner and outer walls, and the men at the lumber mill laughed as they cut his order for what seemed like twice the necessary lumber for a cabin his size. He framed the outer wall first, using standard pine boards, sheathing it with a layer of tar paper he had bought at great expense. Then he framed the inner wall, leaving the precise 12-inch gap. Before he put up the inner sheathing, the packing began. Day after day, his wagon creaked back from the mill, piled high with sawdust. He mixed it with the moss he had painstakingly gathered and dried, a process that stained his hands and filled the air with an earthy scent. The moss, he knew, was not just filler. Its natural properties resisted rot and pests, and it helped manage any moisture that might find its way into the wall cavity. He packed the mixture by hand, tamping it down gently with a long pole, ensuring it was dense enough to prevent settling, but not so compact as to lose its airy structure. Elias Thorne made it a point to stop by one afternoon, his posture radiating a paternalistic concern that was barely disguised contempt. "Jorgensen," he began, his voice slow and deliberate, as if explaining a complex idea to a child. "I don't mean to tell you your business, but that dust, it's a wick. One spark from your stovepipe, and this whole foolish thing will go up like a torch." Thorn gestured to his own cabin, 100 yards away. "Solid oak, 16 inches thick. You can't burn that down if you try. It holds the heat. That's how a man stays warm out here. Mass. You need mass." Axel paused his work, wiping a sheen of sweat and sawdust from his brow. He looked at Thorn's cabin, then back at his own intricate wall cavity. He knew Thorn was wrong. The mass of that oak was precisely the problem. It was a thermal bridge, a direct connection between the warm interior and the frozen exterior. His own wall had very little mass, but it had immense resistance. He tried to explain in his halting English. "Not mass," he said quietly, tapping the wall. "Dead air. Air does not move. Heat does not move." Thorn just shook his head and chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. "Dead air is just empty, Jorgensen. You're building an empty wall. You'll be colder than any of us. You'll be burning through your woodpile by Christmas and coming to us for more." He clapped Axel on the shoulder with a heavy hand. "You'll learn. We all have to learn the hard way out here." The mockery was not confined to Thorn. As Axel installed his windows, which were noticeably smaller than his neighbors and set deep within the thick wall, others commented. "Afraid of the sunlight, Finn?" one called out. Axel was, in fact, afraid of the heat loss that large single panes of glass represented. He had even constructed simple insulated shutters for each window, another feature deemed eccentric and unnecessary. His low ceiling was a constant source of jokes about him being a small man, though he was as tall as any of them. They could not comprehend that every decision, the raised floor, the double walls, the packed insulation, the small windows, the low ceiling, was part of a single coherent system designed for one purpose: thermal efficiency. Axel said little in response. He was not a man for arguments. His confidence was not in his words, but in his hands and in the principles he knew to be true. He worked with a methodical patience that his neighbors mistook for slow-wittedness. Every board was measured twice. Every seam was sealed. He finished the roof, packing the space between the ceiling joists with an even thicker layer of his sawdust and moss mixture. By the first snowfall in November, the Finn's folly was complete. From the outside, it looked unremarkable, if a bit stout. But inside, it was a different world. The air was still. The silence was profound. The very quality of the light seemed softer, held within the room. Axel's preparations were done. Now, all he could do was wait for the winter to serve as the ultimate judge. The winter of 1887 to 1888 began with a deceptive mildness. The settlers grew complacent. The jokes about Axel's cabin subsided into a kind of background murmur. But on the morning of January 12th, 1888, the world changed. The day began with an eerie, unseasonable warmth. The temperature climbed above freezing, and a light rain began to fall, turning the snow-covered plains into a slushy, miserable mire. Children went to school in light coats. Farmers tended to their livestock, grumbling about the mud. Then, in the early afternoon, without warning, the front hit. A wall of black cloud rolled in from the north, and the temperature plummeted. In a matter of minutes, it dropped from 34 degrees Fahrenheit to well below zero, and the rain turned instantly to a fine, blinding powder of snow, driven by a wind that rose to a violent, deafening shriek of over 60 miles per hour. This was the schoolhouse blizzard. It was not a snowstorm. It was a terrestrial hurricane of ice and wind. The air became so thick with snow that visibility dropped to zero. People were caught feet from their own homes, unable to see, becoming hopelessly lost and freezing to death in their own yards. The wind, armed with ice particles, was a physical force, stripping paint from barns and stinging any exposed skin like 1,000 needles. The temperature continued to fall, reaching 40 degrees below zero, with the wind chill plunging to a level that was simply unsurvivable. Inside Elias Thorne's cabin, the storm's arrival was an assault. The wind hit the north-facing oak wall like a battering ram. A low, continuous moan filled the room. Almost immediately, the weaknesses of the conventional design were laid bare. The mud and moss chinking, made damp by the morning's rain, had frozen solid and contracted. Hairline cracks opened up everywhere, and the wind forced its way through with a high-pitched whistle. Icy drafts sliced through the air, stirring the rushes on the floor and making the flames in the stone fireplace dance and gutter. Thorne's wife, Sarah, rushed to stuff rags into the largest of the cracks, but it was a hopeless task. For every one she plugged, 2 more seemed to appear. The massive oak logs themselves, once a source of pride, became conduits of cold. The inner surface of the north wall was soon covered in a thick layer of frost. It was so cold to the touch that it felt like touching a block of ice. The immense thermal mass Thorne had boasted of was now working against him, leaching the heat from the room at an astonishing rate. The great stone fireplace, another point of pride, was a thermodynamic disaster. Its massive, uninsulated chimney was a superhighway for heat to escape. Most of the warmth generated by the fire roared straight up the flue and out into the storm, while the fire itself drew in huge gulps of the cabin's already chilled air to feed its combustion, creating even more drafts. The family huddled close to the hearth, their fronts roasting while their backs felt frozen. Their newborn son, wrapped in every blanket they owned, began to cry with a thin, weak wail. Thorne furiously fed wood into the fire, logs of seasoned oak that should have lasted for hours but were now being consumed in minutes. He had to make a perilous journey to the woodpile, just 20 yards from his door. He tied a rope from the doorknob to his waist and plunged into the white chaos. The wind tore the breath from his lungs. The cold was a physical pain. He returned gasping, his beard frozen solid, with an armload of wood that was already coated in a shell of ice from the earlier rain. The frozen wood sputtered and smoked in the fireplace, producing more soot than heat. By the second day of the blizzard, a grim reality was setting in. Their massive woodpile, which they had thought would last until March, was dwindling at an alarming rate. The cabin was getting colder, the interior temperature dropping to just above freezing, despite the roaring fire. The baby's cries grew weaker. Desperation began to creep into the room, as cold and insidious as the drafts themselves. Less than a quarter-mile away, inside the Finn's Folly, the storm was an acoustic event, not a thermal one. The 60-mile-per-hour gale that screamed across the prairie was reduced by the time it passed through the outer wall and the 12 inches of packed insulation to a distant, muffled howl. There were no drafts, not a single one. The air inside was perfectly still. The inner walls were warm to the touch. Axel's small, efficient cast-iron stove sat in the center of the room, radiating a steady, even heat. He fed it a single, small log of dried birch every 2 hours. The fire burned cleanly and slowly, with the stove's damper turned almost completely shut. Because the cabin was so airtight, the stove's combustion was incredibly efficient, wringing every last unit of heat from the wood. The scientific principles were performing exactly as he had calculated. The outer wall took the full force of the wind, creating a pocket of still air in its lee. The thick layer of insulation stopped the conductive flow of heat almost completely. The temperature differential between the inner and outer surfaces of the wall cavity was immense, perhaps 70 degrees warm on the inside and 40 below zero on the outside. But the dead air within the wall simply refused to transfer that energy. The airtight construction prevented any infiltration of cold air. The low ceiling kept the bubble of warm air right where he and his modest living space were. The small, shuttered windows leaked almost no heat. Axel's cabin was not fighting the storm. It was ignoring it. While Elias Thorne was risking his life to fetch frozen wood, Axel's fuel was neatly stacked in a small box by his stove, perfectly dry and seasoned. He had built a small enclosed lean-to on the south side of his cabin, a woodshed that was itself protected by the main structure and had filled it in the autumn. He did not need a massive woodpile because his consumption of fuel was a tiny fraction of his neighbor's. He was sipping at his energy reserves while they were hemorrhaging theirs. On the morning of the second day, Axel began to document his success. It was not for pride, but for his own understanding. He was a man who believed in evidence. He took out a small mercury thermometer, a prized possession he had purchased in Fargo. He hung it in the center of the room. It registered a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He then, out of curiosity, briefly opened the door and placed it on his outer porch. The mercury dropped so quickly it seemed to vanish, bottoming out at the thermometer's limit of -40 degrees. He brought it back inside, and within 10 minutes, it had returned to a comfortable 68. He recorded the readings in a small ledger next to a careful tally of the logs he had burned. 8 small logs in 24 hours. He knew from conversations with his neighbors that they would burn 30 or 40 large logs on a normal winter day. In this storm, Thorne was likely burning over 100. Axel felt a quiet satisfaction, but it was overshadowed by a growing concern. The storm was not abating. The wind had not slackened its relentless assault. He knew the conditions in the other cabins. He knew their construction. He knew they were in trouble. He thought of the Thornes' new baby. He sat in his warm, quiet fortress, eating a simple meal of rye bread and salted fish, and listened to the muffled voice of the blizzard, knowing that survival was not just about the strength of a wall, but the strength of a community. His vindication would be meaningless if it came at the cost of his neighbors' lives. By the evening of the third day, the situation in the Thorne cabin had become dire. The last of the easily accessible wood was gone. The interior temperature had dropped to below freezing. Frost now coated everything, and their own breath plumed in the air. The fire in the hearth was a pathetic, smoky thing, and Thorne was reduced to breaking up a wooden chair to feed it. Sarah sat huddled in their bed, clutching their infant son to her chest, trying to warm him with her own fading body heat. The baby was listless, his skin a terrifying shade of blue. They were freezing to death in the very home that was supposed to protect them. Elias Thorne, a proud and stubborn man, finally faced a truth more powerful than his pride. His methods had failed. His wisdom was folly. His family was going to die. He made a decision. He wrapped himself in every layer of clothing he possessed. He looked at his wife. "I'm going to Jorgensen's," he said, his voice hoarse. "If we stay here, we won't see morning." He did not know if Axel was alive. He did not know if he could even find the cabin in the blinding chaos. But it was the only hope they had. He tied the rope around his waist again, took a deep breath and plunged out into the storm, crawling on his hands and knees, following the fence line he knew ran between their properties. Every foot was a battle. The wind tried to scour him from the face of the earth, but the image of his son's blue skin drove him forward. Inside, Axel was startled by a frantic, rhythmic pounding on his door. It was a sound that seemed impossible amidst the roar of the wind. He unbarred the door, and the storm tried to force its way in. A figure, so covered in snow and ice it was barely human, collapsed onto the floor. It was Elias Thorne. He was gasping, his face frostbitten, his clothes frozen stiff. My family," he choked out. "The baby. We're freezing." Axel did not hesitate. There was no "I told you so" in his eyes, no hint of triumph. There was only urgency and compassion. He helped Thorne to a chair by the stove, pulling off his frozen gloves. "We will bring them," Axel said, his voice calm and steady. He grabbed his own heavy coat and another length of rope. Following Thorne's line back, the two men fought their way to the other cabin. They found Sarah Thorne semi-conscious, the baby barely breathing. Together, they wrapped them in blankets and half-carried, half-dragged them through the blizzard back to the warmth and safety of Axel's home. The moment Sarah and the baby crossed the threshold into Axel's cabin was a moment of profound, shocking contrast. They moved from a world of screaming wind and lethal cold into a pocket of absolute stillness and gentle, enveloping warmth. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah began to weep, tears of relief freezing on her cheeks. Axel took the baby from her, unwrapped him, and began to gently rub the infant's tiny limbs, bringing the life and color back into them. The silence in the room, the sheer absence of wind and drafts, was the most astonishing thing. Thorne stood in the middle of the room, slowly turning, his eyes wide with disbelief. He touched the inner wall. It was warm. He looked at the small stove, which was consuming a tiny log with a quiet, efficient hum. He looked at the thermometer, which still read 68 degrees. All his deeply held beliefs, all his frontier common sense, had been shattered in an instant. He was standing inside a miracle. His pride was gone, replaced by a humbling, desperate need to understand. He looked at Axel, who was now feeding his son a little warm water with a spoon. "How?" Thorne asked, his voice barely a whisper. "There is no wind. The walls, they are warm. How?" Axel finished tending to the child before he answered. He gestured to the wall. "The wind cannot pass through the first wall," he explained simply. "The cold cannot pass through the air in the middle. The heat stays inside." He pointed to the low ceiling. "The heat stays here, with us." He pointed to the stove. "So, it needs only a little wood." It was the same explanation he had tried to give Thorne months before, but now the words landed with the force of revelation. Thorne walked to the wall again and pressed his ear against it, as if he could hear the secret it held. All he heard was a faint, distant murmur, the sound of a vanquished enemy. He was not just in a warmer house. He was inside a different idea, a superior understanding of the world. He had built a fortress to fight the winter. Axel Jorgensen had built a shelter that made peace with it. The great blizzard of 1888 raged for 3 full days. When it finally broke, the settlers emerged into a world transformed, a landscape of immense sculpted snowdrifts under a brilliantly clear sky. The cost had been terrible. Lives were lost across the territory. Livestock had frozen in the fields. But in the small community in Pembina County, the story that emerged was one of failure and one of astonishing success. Thorn and his family had survived, as had two other families Axel had guided to his shelter during the storm's final day. His small cabin, built for one, had housed 11 people in warmth and safety. In the spring, the work of rebuilding began, but it was accompanied by a revolution in thinking. The Finn's folly was no longer a joke. It was a subject of intense study. Elias Thorn, once the primary skeptic, became Axel's most devoted student. He formally asked Axel to teach him. There was no mockery left in him, only a quiet, earnest desire to learn. Axel, with his characteristic patience, walked Thorn and the other men through every step of his design. He did not just show them what to do, he explained why it worked, drawing diagrams in the dirt to illustrate the principles of conduction, convection, and dead air. That summer, a new kind of construction began across the settlement. It was a season of retrofitting. The men, under Axel's guidance, built new exterior walls around their existing log cabins. They left a wide gap and traveled to the sawmill, their wagons now hauling sawdust not as a novelty, but as a precious resource. They packed the walls, sealed the cracks, lowered ceilings, and installed smaller, more sensible windows. Miss Eleanor Vance, the schoolteacher who had observed the entire affair with a keen, curious eye, documented the transformation in her journal. She noted the change in the men's attitudes, the way they now listened to the quiet Finn with a deep and abiding respect. He was no longer an outcast. He was their unwilling prophet of practical survival. The following winter was the true test. It was a typically harsh Dakota winter, but the difference in the community was profound. Miss Vance's journal, which she later used as the basis for a report to the Territorial Agricultural Society, recorded the data. Elias Thorn, who in the winter before the blizzard had burned through nearly 20 cords of wood, consumed just 6. His cabin, once a drafty icebox, now maintained a steady temperature. His infant son, who had nearly perished, was now a thriving, healthy toddler. Across the community, the story was the same. Fuel consumption was cut by more than half. The health of the residents improved dramatically. The elderly, who often succumbed to winter illnesses, survived in greater numbers. The cabins were not just warmer, they were quieter, more comfortable, and safer. The Jorgensen Wall, as it came to be known, had fundamentally changed their relationship with the environment. Word of the method began to spread. Miss Vance's article, published under the title Practical Principles of Thermal Insulation for the Prairie Homesteader, was reprinted in newspapers across the upper Midwest. Letters arrived in Pembina for Axel Jorgensen, filled with detailed questions from settlers in Minnesota, Montana, and even the Canadian provinces. He answered them all, drawing careful diagrams and explaining the principles in simple, direct language. He never sought fame or fortune from his innovation. For him, the knowledge was like air or water, something to be shared for the benefit of all. His reward was seeing the community around him thrive, secure against the brutal winters that had once held them in a state of constant, anxious siege. The legacy of the Jorgensen Wall is a quiet one, absorbed into the fabric of building history. It was a direct precursor to the insulated wall cavities that are standard in modern construction. The principles Axel Jorgensen demonstrated through painstaking labor and observation are the same principles that govern building science today. What he called dead air, we now quantify with a specific metric, the R value, a measure of thermal resistance. His airtight construction is the ancestor of the modern air barrier and the concept of building a tight envelope. His understanding of how heat moves through a structure is the very foundation of thermal dynamics. The Jorgensen wall was, in essence, an early, intuitive version of a high-performance passive building system. He understood that the most powerful tool against the cold was not a bigger fire, but a smarter wall. The story of Axel Jorgensen is more than a historical account of a clever innovation. It is a parable about the nature of wisdom. It reminds us that conventional thinking, no matter how entrenched, is often a poor substitute for empirical observation. The settlers of Pembina County believed in the logic of mass and force, a logic that was direct and easy to understand. Axel believed in the invisible, subtle logic of the natural world, a logic learned from bison fur and sawdust, from Finnish tradition, and a deep respect for the power of the elements. He faced ridicule not because he was wrong, but because his ideas were unfamiliar and counterintuitive. His ultimate vindication serves as a timeless lesson that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are not born in a flash of genius, but are pieced together slowly from the quiet, persistent application of practical knowledge. In the end, the howling Dakota wind could not defeat a wall built of little more than waste wood and the profound, unyielding warmth of a dead-still breath of air.